Good evening, everyone. I'm Matthew Taylor. I'm Chief Executive of the RSA. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all here for this evening's special event. Before we kick off, a quick reminder that we're filming tonight's event and live streaming over the web, so welcome to everyone joining us online, even though that's slightly ironic. And a reminder that if you'd like to get involved in the discussion, the hashtag is hashtag RSA Tech. That's slightly ironic as well, given that we might be talking about Twitter at some point in our conversations. Anyway, I do hope you'll get stuck in and let us know what you think, because tonight's event is part of a series of RSA talks and projects aiming to build a new public conversation about how technology can better serve individual human needs as well as the wider public good. In the wake of the tech-driven scandals and crises that have hit countries across the world in the last couple of years, we're looking at what can be done to restore trust and confidence in the platforms that we now know wield such a huge amount of power and influence over our personal lives and politics. So to help us start to answer some of these questions, it's really a great honor and privilege to be able to hear from someone at the very forefront of this debate, Roger McNamee. Roger is a legendary Silicon Valley investor who has had a 35-year career supporting and shaping some of the biggest developments in technology innovation in recent decades. Famously, he was an early Facebook shareholder and personal advisor to Mark Zuckerberg, but starting in early 2016, he began to have serious concerns about the company's business model, culture, and priorities. In the years since, he has become a leading light in the fight against what he sees as the existential threats posed by Facebook and the big tech giants to our political order and to our public health. He tells this story brilliantly in his book, Zucked, Waking Up to the Facebook, you see what he did there? Yeah. Waking Up to the Facebook Catastrophe. And tonight, he'll share some of the key moments of the journey he's been on, as well as exploring the actions we need to take now as policymakers, business leaders, employees, consumers, and citizens to build a better future for technology and society. So after Roger's spoken, I'll be engaging him in some follow-up conversation before we open up the discussion to all of you here tonight, and maybe even people online. We're looking forward to lots of comments and questions before we wrap up at 7 o'clock. So we've got a packed hour ahead, so let's get started. Please welcome Roger McNamee.
This is an extraordinary thrill for me. I am a big fan of Benjamin Franklin, who apparently was the first overseas fellow of the RSA. And to be in this hallowed hall is a big deal for me because, well, let's just put it this way, it's unexpected. As Matthew said, I spent my career as a technology optimist in Silicon Valley. I arrived there before the personal computer industry was really an industry, when Silicon Valley was focused on the space program, the space shuttle in particular. I was lucky enough to be there for the entire ride of personal computers, data networking, enterprise software, the internet, and everything that followed. I was part of Kleiner Perkins when they made the first investment in Netscape, Amazon, Google. I was lucky enough to be a mentor to Mark Zuckerberg in the early days of Facebook. It never occurred to me that entire time that I would ever be in a position of being a critic of Silicon Valley. The Silicon Valley that I joined in 1982, and the one that I spent most of my career in, was one that was in the business of empowering the people who used its products. And as a professional analyst, I am really embarrassed to admit that I missed the signals, the really important signals, that the culture of Silicon Valley changed in the early years of the millennium, and that it went from being this very positive, empowering thing to, by roughly 2012 or 2013, to being a place where the most successful companies were based on business models that started by violating the law. That would be Airbnb, Uber, and Lyft. Or creating addiction. That would be Juul. Or exploiting the ignorance of a community. That would be Spotify. And I realized at that point I had passed my sell-by date. And so I retired. And immediately, at the end of 2015, when I retired, a month later, I saw something going on Facebook that disturbed me. And over the course of the spring of 2016, I saw examples related to the Democratic primary, civil rights, and then Brexit, where I realized that the business model and algorithms of Facebook could be used not just for good and not just for the benefit of helping advertisers find their customers at a lower cost and consumers find things they were interested in at a lower cost. They could also be used to undermine democracy and to undermine civil rights. And it took me 4 months before I could find anybody who would talk to me about this issue. I was asked to write an opinion piece for the technology blog Recode. And while I was drafting it, the news came out that the Russians were actively attempting to interfere in the US general election. And my wife Ann, who's here with us today, encouraged me to send my draft opinion piece to Mark Zuckerberg and Sheryl Sandberg, which I did 9 days before the US presidential election in 2016. And I was warning my friends of this flaw in the business model and the algorithms, which I viewed as systemic. And I viewed it as a situation where they were the victim and unintentionally they were undermining civil rights and democracy. And I encouraged them to do what Johnson & Johnson did after a man put poison in bottles of the Tylenol analgesic in Chicago, Illinois in 1982. CEO did not wait for the government to tell him what to do. The very day the news broke, he withdrew every bottle of Tylenol from every retail shelf in America and didn't put it back until they invented tamper-proof packaging. This was a famous story in marketing because while the short-term cost was huge, the long-term benefit was much greater. And I begged Sheryl and Mark to do this. This is what Boeing should have done with the 737 MAX. The problem is that the culture of business in America, not just the culture of Silicon Valley, but all business in America, no longer treats consumers as a real customer worthy of protection. We're very much in a world where there are very few rules, where the role that government played in capitalism of setting rules and then enforcing them fairly for everyone has been eroded steadily over 40 years to the point where it's a free-for-all, which favors the powerful at the expense of everyone else. I spent 3 months begging Facebook to do the right thing. They retreated behind one phrase: Roger, we're a platform, not a media company. We are not responsible for the actions of third parties. And I'm saying, guys, your business is based on trust. Once you lose it, you will never regain it. I'm begging you, please get this right. They were not interested. It's possible, perhaps likely, that I was the wrong messenger. It's possible that I was giving them the wrong message. For whatever reason, I failed. And I concluded that with the 2018 midterm elections fast approaching and 2020 beyond it, that I needed to share with the US government and the public at large what I understood about the business model and culture of Facebook. So I became an activist. It is not a role that I am born to. And I have found it to be an extreme challenge. When I began, I found an ally, a young man named Tristan Harris, who had been the design ethicist at Google. He was an expert in persuasive technology. He helped me to understand the mechanisms of the business model of Facebook in a way that I had not appreciated before. That these are media companies. They're competing against television, newspapers, magazines, radio, video games, Netflix, sports. They need our attention. They get it initially by appealing to the weakest elements of human psychology, the things we cannot evade no matter how hard we try. As human beings, we have an unstoppable need for rewards. We need social validation. They send us notifications. 42 people liked your post. Yay! Please join my network on LinkedIn. Or, you've been tagged in a photograph. Would you like to tag some other people? Now, with the LinkedIn and the tagging, they trigger another inescapable human need. The need for social reciprocity. Somebody's done something nice for us. I got to do something nice back. They begin a cycle. And they do it on a device that is on your body. And the next thing you know, every free moment you're checking your phone. You say to yourself, well, what's the harm in that? It's just a habit. The problem is this kind of habit can soon become an addiction. Who among us has never once checked their smartphone while they were driving? I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands. There's no point. The reason is, for all of us, we do things that we know are bad. We cannot help it. That's called an addiction. And people say, well, Roger, I'm not really addicted. And I go, hey, there's a simple test. When do you check your phone first thing in the morning? Is it before you pee? Or while you're peeing? Because for most of us, that's the range, right? It's somewhere in there. But that's not enough just to get you to come to the site. Now they got to get you to spend a lot of time. Here they move to the second phase, which is they go for the lizard brain. This is the most fundamental psychological wiring of human beings. And for roughly 2/3 of the population, the most effective way to get people to engage with an internet site is to appeal to flight or fight, fear or outrage. They do this with 3 content types: hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. Now here's the thing. They don't like hate speech, disinformation, and conspiracy theories. The algorithms, though, are trained to reinforce the things we like. And they are tailored to each and every one of us as an individual. And for 2/3 of us, the thing that works best is flight or fight. And it's not because we like hate speech, it's that we cannot help but react to it because it triggers things in us that we cannot avoid. It's like dealing with a magician, right? It doesn't matter how much education you have. The magician's tricks work, right? It just, you just can't help it. And that's how this works. And the next thing you know, you're on there 35 minutes a day. The thing I didn't know then, that I subsequently learned from a Harvard professor named Shoshana Zuboff, who wrote a book called The Age of Surveillance Capitalism, which is to the 21st century what Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations was to the 18th and 19th century. It describes a brand new economic system that actually dominates the economy and which hardly anybody can understand. She names all the components, explains how they work and why they matter. So for all of us, the thing I took from The Age of Surveillance Capitalism is this is not just about Facebook. It's about Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon. 4 companies who had an idea really early that was simply brilliant. Google basically converts human experience into data. They then run it through machine learning and create a data voodoo doll. So when I say converting human experience into data, what do I mean? So it starts with, you do searches, right? They learn a lot about you based on what you search. Then you use Google Maps. They find out a lot more about where you go. Then you use Gmail. They find out a whole lot about you based on what you're sending in Gmail. Then you use Google Docs. They find out even more. But you know, a lot of that stuff is static. In fact, they also just do our environment, right? So Google Street View, send cars with 360-degree cameras, take pictures of our home. satellite view, take a picture of it from the top. But they decided we got to go to real time. We got to look at human experience as it's happening. How do you do that? Ha! Google Glass. We'll give you a pair of glasses with a camera and a little computer screen in the corner. And you'll wander around and you'll capture everything you do, every person you meet. We do facial recognition. We don't just identify who the person is. We figure out their state of mind. There are 1,000 muscles in your face. And if you analyze them, you can figure out if a person's happy, sad. We hated Google Glass. Do you remember what we called the people who wore it? Glass holes. So they go back in the lab because they're really good engineers. The idea's right, but the packaging's wrong. They repackage it as a video game. But they're Google. They're really, really smart, right? So they're not going to just put it out as a Google product because maybe we won't go for it. Maybe we'll recognize it's just Google Glass repackaged. So they call it a new company name, Niantic. The game is called Pokemon Go. Suddenly, there are 1 billion people with smartphones recording everything they're doing for an hour or two a day, capturing all the people they see, doing facial recognition. Think about this for a minute. You say, so, well, what's the harm of that? Well, you think you're playing a game, but Google's got totally different plans. Google says, well, hey, we got 1 billion people, let's do a few experiments. We're in a post-9/11 world. People will not knock on the door of a total stranger. Well, how about if we put a Pokemon in the backyard? Suddenly, people are lined up to knock on a stranger's door. How about if we put a Pokemon on the other side of a fence? Will they climb it? Yes, they will. Well, how about if we put a Poke Gym in a Starbucks or a McDonald's, some advertiser who's paying us money? Can we get them to buy stuff? We can. Now, I am personally very concerned about the Chinese with their behavioral manipulation because they have a product called social credit. You know something? There are only 800 million people in China with internet access. There were 1 billion people in the experiment run on Pokemon Go. And my point here is, maybe it's harmful, maybe it's harmless, I don't know. The point is we didn't know. Because B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist, his view was the subject can never know the experiment's happening. So what you need to understand is surveillance capitalism is based on the premise that experiments are being run on us without our knowledge, much less our consent. I got a problem with that. So my job, the reason I'm here today, is to make you aware so we can have a fulsome discussion about how do we feel about this. Because maybe we're all fine with it, right? But it ought to be a conscious choice. Because the implications are profound. And the thing to understand is that the people at Google are not bad people. But they have a very specific philosophy that we should discuss. And their philosophy is that the world is really inefficient. Right? People are wandering around and they have anxiety because they have to make so many choices. Life is stressful. And Google's notion is there's so much wasted value in that. If we convert all human experience into data and create these data voodoo dolls, we can eliminate that efficiency by making predictions of human behavior and selling it to marketers. That'll take so much inefficiency. These billboards or TV ads are hitting all these people who don't care. We're going to get the targeting not only targeted by demographics, we're going to get it targeted by time. They look at life events, buying a car, buying a home, getting married, having a baby. And they look at the population in its entirety. Every single person who's bought a car, bought a home, gotten married, gotten pregnant. And look at all the steps they take leading up to it. Maybe years worth of steps. They look for the patterns. And then as people start to get onto the path, they can make a forecast, 20% probability, 50%, 70, 90. And the value of the prediction goes up as the certainty approaches 100%. It's a hell of a business. It's completely transformed marketing because for the first time, Marketers have perfect information. But here's the catch. What do we have? We trust Google. We trust Facebook. We trust Amazon. We trust Microsoft to be an honest broker of information. But what are they doing? They're taking that same data voodoo doll and massaging your search results to reflect the behavioral predictions that they have sold, to drive you towards things that are economically valuable to them. They are reducing the choices available to you. Why? Because it's more efficient. Now, the problem with optimizing for efficiency is that there are consequences. I would postulate, and it's a hypothesis, that two of the biggest opportunities for improving efficiency come from eliminating human choice and from reducing the impact of democracy. And I believe if you study Google's behavior and Google's actions, particularly their smart cities projects called Sidewalk Labs, currently attempting to do a big project in Toronto, that you will see that not by design, but by necessary consequence, two casualties are human choice and democracy. That does not make Google bad, but it is a philosophy, and it happens to run contrary to the values of the Enlightenment. I'm a big fan of the Enlightenment. So I want us to have a conversation. And here's what I'd like you to do. I would like you to join me in a thought experiment. I'm not here to convince you that I am right. I am here to lay out what I know as someone who's spent their entire life in the tech industry, entire adult life, as someone who feels they owe a debt to society. I'm here to make you aware of what I know and to ask you to join me in a thought experiment. What would you do differently if I were right? Imagine 5 years from now. What would you wish you'd done today? I was last week in Cologne at the Demexco Digital Marketing Trade Show. And I got to give a speech to all these professional marketers and advertising agencies. And I pointed out, Amazon, right? We all know Amazon. Amazon starts out as a retailer. Now they have one of the largest ad networks on earth. They've got Alexa listening in. They're vertically integrating, right? They start with a marketplace that lets third parties come in and sell using Amazon's extraordinary delivery service. But Amazon's business proposition is that there are only two brand values that matter: price and convenience. Now, if you're BMW, you're Tiffany, Cartier, if you're Procter & Gamble or Unilever, you go, whoa, 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 there's way more brand values than just price and convenience. But Amazon is systematically undercutting all the others. In the marketplace, they encourage, effectively, counterfeits and imitators. They have their own private label called Amazon Basics, based on taking all this data they have from the people in their marketplace and converting everybody to a focus on price and then use the convenience of their delivery platform. The point I made to the Demexco audience was in 5 years, most of them would be out of a job, and there would be no need for that conference. And Facebook is going into the reserve currency business with Libra. I don't know about you, but when I look at the foundational elements of a sovereign nation, I note that the control legitimate force is one of the foundational elements, but currency is the other one. And they're going after that. And Google, with their Smart Cities project, is looking to replace local government with algorithms. I'm going, well, hey, maybe that's a good idea. But I'd like us to all be well informed and make a decision on that rather than having it happen because there is an absence of regulatory, policy, and political will to rein it in. In order to wrap this thing up, what I want you to understand is that I think there are two things that we need to think about to solve this problem. When I first wrote the book, I want us to engage politically, and I thought we could do things in our own behavior that would make a difference. I no longer believe that our individual actions on these platforms matter that much, and the reason for that is that the data that you put into Facebook or Instagram or YouTube or Google represents about 1/10% of the data that they have about you. They get 2 orders of magnitude more data just from tracking you relentlessly as you go around the web. They buy every data point that you touch in the digital world. So every time you use a credit card, every time you're captured your cell phone with your location, right? Health stuff. They have the highest resolution picture you can imagine, right? This whole thing of, are they listening to you? They don't need to listen to you because they can predict increasingly well what you're likely to do, and they control the choices available to you so they can raise the probability of that coming true. So what do we need to do about it? We need to recognize that there are 4 harms. Democracy is harmed, public health is harmed, privacy is harmed, and competition is harmed. For competition, we want to use antitrust law to create space for alternatives. In the United States, the regulatory framework applied to AT&T is the starting point, which is you essentially throw their intellectual property into the public domain, you restrict them to a smaller space than the one they operate in, and then you force them to make their infrastructure available to competitors to lower the barriers for competitors to get to scale. You also eventually want to apply the things used against the robber barons in the early 20th century, which is that you restrict their ability to both manage a marketplace and participate in it, and then eventually you break them up. But that's the last step. That's for competition. But for the other 3, so this is public health, democracy, and privacy. The thing to understand is all of those things exist because there is a third-party marketplace in your most intimate data. And I would like to postulate that the data about you, that data avatar, is as much a representation of you, as much a part of you, as your kidneys. You are not legally allowed to sell your kidneys. You should not legally be allowed to sell your data, and God knows no one else should be allowed to. I want to postulate that our private data is a human right, not an asset. And that we should ban all third-party transactions and all exploitation of personal data and data voodoo dolls. That's going to take action from all of us. We have to go to each election that comes up, to every politician we can possibly find, and say, this must stop now. And everyone can play. There is increasing awareness among politicians. The thing that is missing is the support from us. We are as addicted as marketers to the convenience of these products. And the question you need to ask yourself tonight is this. If you knew that by changing your behavior and getting involved politically, you could protect your health and that of your children, you could help to restore democracy, you could regain the ability to make choices without fear, and you could restore innovation and competition in the economy, would you make changes? Would you forego some convenience? Would you be willing to take a chance on interrupting these guys? I'd like to think the answer is yes, but the choice is yours. I want to thank you all for coming, and I want to take questions now, but the first thing I want to say before I do this, just to help set the ground for questions, Facebook and Google, and Microsoft and Amazon know you're here with me tonight. So you might as well join the rebellion, because it's a lot easier to beat the Death Star before it's operational, okay? Thank you all for coming out. traditional in my meetings that we always start the questions with one of the women in the audience.
I'm starting the questions.
You're going to ask
Yeah.
questions. And they don't get asked.
No, they get asked afterwards.
Okay,
It's
but
my turn first.
when we get there, I'd like them to go first.
Yeah,
Okay, the
okay.
ladies first.
Yeah, fine.
Okay, so you're impersonating a lady for the moment. Okay,
Yeah,
great.
okay, I'll be gender fluid. As well as being a successful entrepreneur and an activist, you're also actually a very accomplished and successful musician. And rather like a successful musician, you've played your set, and you've actually not played one of your greatest hits, which is one of the critical points you want to make is about the role of these firms in driving political polarization. So just very briefly, because maybe you were saving that for your encore, just kind of tell us a little bit about that. Particularly
I saved the best hit for last.
particularly from the American perspective.
So-
Funnily enough, I'm doing an event tomorrow night with the Pew Center about polarization and the role of social media. And it's amazing the proportion of Americans that get all their information now from social media.
So the way to think about this, remember how I said to you that in order to get you to spend a lot of time, they reinforce the things you like, right? And the definition of like is it's the things you respond to. So you may not like hate speech, but if it gets your blood boiling and you react, then that qualifies as liking in their thing. So what happens is by reinforcing the things you react to over and over again, they create what is known as a filter bubble, which is a sealed environment where all the ideas increasingly represent one viewpoint and other viewpoints cannot get through. The problem with that is that you wind up on Facebook with 2.4 billion Truman shows. Everybody has their own environment. Often they have their own facts. In the United States, 40% of the population identifies with at least one issue that is demonstrably false. 1 in 3 Americans believe there is no link between human activity and climate change. Roughly 7% believes there is a linkage between vaccination and autism. Another couple percent believe the earth is flat. And there are a gazillion other conspiracy theories, and when you get rid of the deduplication, it's about 40%. Well, hang on. It's okay to disagree about what to do about climate change, but if you can't agree on the facts, you can't have a conversation. And if in a world where all your information sources agree with what you agree with, anyone who disagrees becomes the enemy. And so suddenly the ability to have compromise, the ability to have thoughtful conversation goes away. And if you look at the design of these products, they're designed to keep you moving, right? News feeds with no end, autoplay on videos. They're designed to be mindless and thoughtless. So what winds up happening is we get isolated in filter bubbles, we can no longer communicate, and polarization gets much worse. So the thing to understand is filter bubbles predate these platforms. When I was a kid, everyone in the United States saw the Kennedy funeral, the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show, and the moon landing. And the filter bubble was one that brought us all together. And the big complaint was about conformity. But the filter bubbles in these things are individual. And they make compromise impossible, which undermines democracy. They didn't create the problem, these platforms, but boy, have they magnified it. And they cannot fix the problem. You cannot fix what's wrong with polarization today, with technology. It requires people going and making eye contact. I mean, for me, one of the key things on my journey has been recognizing at the beginning that I needed to make this a nonpartisan issue. And so I went and actively sought out people with whom I disagree on almost every other issue and had thoughtful conversations here. And it has worked. This is unique in the American political conversation now as an issue where there is roughly the same set of issues on both sides. And that gives me hope.
You come from this background as an investor, entrepreneur in technology. I'm assuming that you're no longer on Mark Zuckerberg or Sheryl Sandberg's Christmas card list. But what about the rest of that tech community? How do they view your conversion from entrepreneur to activist?
I would say that folks who are my age or older are very proud of me, but not particularly interested in joining. And the folks who are really actively involved typically will cross the street to avoid interacting with me. So I have a new set of friends, and I'm very comfortable with that. I mean, Silicon Valley was very kind to me. And history may suggest in the end that I wasted my time here, but it's my time to waste. And it's a choice I've consciously made, and the consequences of which I consciously accept. And, you know, I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not asking for anything other than to consider this in the context of your own life and that of your family members and your loved ones.
Two last questions before we open it out. The first is that as Professor Zuboff explains in the kind of companion volume to yours, although I would say your book is more readable, Surveillance Capitalism, she explains kind of forensically the evolution of the business model in these companies. And you talk about this a bit as well, but she really kind of, you know, she goes through it line by line.
I have the hypothesis, she's got the data. I mean, it's really, seriously, if she does not get the Nobel Prize in economics, they should just stop giving them, because they've given so many to bozos, it's like...
But this takes me to this point. Do you think that one of the things this story tells us is not just about tech firms, actually, but about capitalism in general, is that it is actually really important to understand how corporations make their money. And then I think in the past, when corporations have talked about transparency, there'll be transparency about their carbon emissions or maybe their gender pay gap more recently in this country or whatever. And that's all fine, but often the really hard conversation is about how do those organizations, and actually if you look at many corporations, you'd be surprised at what their business model isn't what you think it is. I mean, McDonald's, for example, which I think is quite a good company, but they don't really make hamburgers, they're a real estate firm. Other companies are actually becoming data companies. So do you think that learning that we didn't really understand Facebook until we understood its business model should teach us more broadly to try to understand how people make money?
Well, I think that the transparency issue is particularly important here because of the central role this industry plays in information flows for the entire economy. That whether McDonald's is a hamburger firm or a real estate firm is more or less isolated to a subsector of the food services industry. And whether General Electric was in the product business or was a financial services firm was isolated to a portion of the industrial or financial markets. These guys actually horizontally dominate marketing everywhere. And so the absence of transparency in their advertising business, because Google is a monopolist of the entire infrastructure of the digital ad market, so they control the entire back end for everyone, has allowed people to suspect with a lot of validity that all of the numbers in the industry, user count, ad views, duration of view, that all those numbers are overstated systemically. And that the problem can't be solved today because it gives rise to a securities law violation that is potentially criminal. And, you know, that systematic fraud relative to revenue and user count is not, you know, you can do it once and that might be civil, but if you do it for long enough, it becomes a much bigger issue. And so these guys will fight to the death to avoid transparency. And the weird thing is that if we gave them a safe harbor and did the reset, we'd be better off, but it wouldn't fix the problem. In some ways, I actually think criminal prosecution may be the best leverage we have. If we're not willing to shut them down because Mark Zuckerberg won't testify in front of the House of Commons, or because in New Zealand, you know, all of these guys enabled a terrorist act that was predictable ahead of time. If we're not willing to go that far, then we have to dig down on this stuff and use the law, because right now, too much of our politics, too much of our economy, too much of our public health, and too much of our privacy is dependent on these companies. And they have not demonstrated any understanding that there is a responsibility that comes with that power.
So last question, then we'll open up. At the end, you said that there was no point us as individuals the RSA, uses Facebook, Twitter's up here, etc. There's no point individuals resisting this. I just want to question that in a sense, because surely the argument that is made by these platforms when politicians come for them is, do you really want to interfere with something that 2 billion people use? Do you really want to interfere with something that 90% of people use? Do you really want to interfere with something which you as a politician use to communicate with your own constituents? That whilst in the end, of course you're right, that it'll be regulation that will, and politics and political decisions that will have to be made, when we're also implicated in it, it's even, politicians are not generally speaking the bravest of people, it is even harder. So that's why when Greta Thunberg says, we shouldn't fly as individuals, although it's a meaningless thing when she doesn't fly, more people are now saying, okay, I do have to do something, because if I don't do anything at all, how can I expect politicians to do it?
And to be clear, I wasn't saying that you shouldn't do it. I'm saying that I no longer view that as the best way to affect change. So personally, I gave up Google for Lent 3 years ago. I do not, I have to still go to YouTube because I'm a musician. There's no way around it. But the rest of Google I basically haven't touched except by accident for almost 3 years. And I gave up using Facebook Messenger. I do not use WhatsApp. I pay for cash up to $400. I am incredibly careful to use only DuckDuckGo's browser and DuckDuckGo's search engine. I use 1Password to guard my passwords for each individual site. I use Apple, not Android. There are all these things that you can do. And I recommend them all to all of you. What I don't think is that even if we got everybody to do it, that would change their behavior. They have the data voodoo dolls. And the thing is, you do not have to be on an internet platform to be dead. If you were in Christchurch, you just needed to be in one of those synagogues. If you were in El Paso, you just needed to be at that Walmart. If you were in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, you only need to be at the Tree of Life Synagogue. If you're in Myanmar, you only need to be a Rohingya. Right? The problem here is not what they do to you with your data, it's what somebody else does to you because of the data in general. And so I look at this as, I would like us all, I asked at the end, my concluding point was, what would you give up in terms of convenience? In my case, the initial loss from going off Google was really annoying, but it took only a week or two to get used to it, and then after that I turned it into a game, and it was fun. Avoiding Google is like playing Frogger. You're just trying to jump on the logs to get across the river. And look, I was the wrong messenger for Mark and Cheryl. I could be the wrong messenger for you. But do not miss the message, okay? Figure it out. Read Shoshana's book. It's way more important than mine. Mine is a lot easier, but hers is really important. And
Let's open it up. So you've established the principle, which I'm going to observe, which we should start with a woman. So,
ladies?
Yeah, there we go. Very good. Thank you very much for helping us out. And we'll take groups of 3, if that's all right, Roger. Yeah, go on.
Hello.
If you could tell us your name, that's great.
Arini. So just a point on Google. So I don't know if anybody knows, and correct me if I'm wrong, but their tagline for a while was "Don't be evil." Yeah. So on that, and they actually removed it, which is quite interesting. I see you, Google, please hire me. So just based on that, so I'm quite a pessimist in the human condition. So I think humans are inherently flawed and selfish. So based on humans managing something as, a bigger commodity as data, do you think it can ever run, smoothly? Do you think is it always going to be a flawed process?
So I do
hold on to that. I know it's an existential question, but hold on to it. And there's a gentleman back there.
I'm Haider. Thank you very much. That was very enlightening. My question is, what can be done to, in a systematic way, drive positive messages on social media platforms? Okay. The reason I ask is, if you look at how good ISIS was at professionally and strategically driving their messages, the other side is so amateuristic compared to that.
I got it.
Right, and then thirdly, we'll have this guy here in the front. There's something about this guy that makes me think he's a tech expert, but I could be completely wrong. It's the lanyard and the T-shirt. It's that look.
I'm just wondering if you could expand on the idea of perhaps why it's taken so long for this to be dealt with, you know, in terms of US regulation and exports.
So let me take all three questions. So I do not believe the people at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, or Amazon are evil, or even remotely so. I believe they're all idealists. But I do believe they have a different worldview. And the nature of the behaviorist models of B.F. Skinner and others are that you have to run your experiments outside the awareness of the participants in the experiment. My job is to shed light on the experiment so that the participants can participate, can understand and make deliberate choices about this, okay? And, you know, I hope that the management teams of these companies will decide they want to be the hero in their own story, because no one can fix this faster and better than the executives at Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and Amazon. And I would love to see them do that. They've achieved their wildest dreams. I mean, what are they doing from here, right? It would be very, very simple. So on the positive messages point, there's something about human nature that causes us to respond to fear and outrage. Most of us respond to fear and outrage more than we respond to positive messages. There are people who do, right? I mean, remember the early days of the internet was all about cat videos. And, you know, what happened was we had the best and brightest minds of a generation making cat videos, and now we have the best and brightest minds of a generation manipulating the behavior of the whole population. I don't like either one of those things, okay? To her point, I don't know how you change human nature. What I want to do is get rid of the algorithmic amplification. I am totally hostile to censorship, but the algorithmic amplification of the things that we like most currently gives radically disproportionate weight to the most hostile voices in our society and gives them much more political power than they have in numbers. I mean, the internet itself lets angry people find each other and to organize. And then these platforms give them the ability to project their message and do harm. And that really scares me. To your question about regulation, particularly in the United States, beginning in the late 70s, we began dismantling the government as the rule setter and enforcer of capitalism. And we've reduced most of the regulatory infrastructure in the United States below the threshold at which they can do their jobs. And on top of that, there was no political appetite for that. I mean, notwithstanding the fact that there's been no income growth in the United States at the family level for more than a generation, we continued to vote as though the status quo was serving the interests of everyone. That is changing. It's changing too slowly from my perspective, but what I'm happy to see is that at least the new initiatives, things like Facebook's Libra, Google's Sidewalk Labs, are gaining intense scrutiny before they are operational. And I think that's super, super important, and that suggests the system can work. And, you know, again, the notion that this is not an issue of left or right, but rather of right and wrong, helps a lot, okay? And again, I do not want to blame the people. I mean, these guys didn't destroy the global economy. They didn't do what Wells Fargo did and take money out of millions of customer accounts, right? They have an ideal that they're pursuing. Now, I happen to disagree with it, right? But they're entitled to their point of view. And my point is, you're entitled to make a choice, whether you like their view or some other view.
Let's try and take two more rounds of questions. So I'll take the gentleman over there and the woman in the front row here. Be as quick as you can and tell us your name, and here comes the mic. No. Well, obviously I can, because I couldn't. Yeah.
John, hi. I'm a physician, and thank you for that. That was wonderful. My point is, the question I want to explore with you is, are politicians enabled to actually do anything? After the Senate House Committee gave Mark Zuckerberg the most easy session ever, it was evident that they rely upon their position, upon what Facebook delivers for them by way of finding their supporters and getting them herded together.
So, hold that question, Yep.
I'm Julie Dawson from Yoti digital identity platform. The Edelman Trust Index is really clear in showing that businesses that do operate in a trustworthy, sustainable way get good staff, retain them, and get customers. And yet we're seeing very few companies, particularly in the tech world, developing good ethics boards, and it only seems to be via whistleblowing that things are starting to come out at times. So how do we get that better balance coming from within the tech
And
companies?
then finally, far corner.
So towards the end of your talk, you said that data is like a human kidney and you shouldn't be able to trade it. I fundamentally disagree with that. I think you should be allowed to trade your data the same way you trade your labor or your ideas. So if people know what they're opting into and they can consent to it, why can't they consent to this big data totalitarianism?
You've got 2 minutes to take those, and we can take 3 more.
Okay, so to the Congress thing, the thing to remember is 2 hours into the Senate hearing with Mark Zuckerberg, the FBI raided the home of Paul Manafort, and the TV channels all changed topics, and you only saw the 80-year-old senators ask questions. If you'd been able to watch the House investigation, you would have seen Mark be cut to smithereens. There was an extraordinary follow-up piece that the Washington Post wrote about that I would encourage you to find. But I am very high confidence Congress can get this right.
Actually, you wrote some of the questions, Roger, so you do have an interest in that answer. But it's true, but yeah.
My colleagues wrote it. I did not. To the issue of trust, we only need to go back 2 years, and Silicon Valley was the most trusted sector of the U.S. economy. We've all learned to trust these guys because for almost 50 years, Silicon Valley empowered us. And like a frog in water coming to a boil, we did not notice that that was changing. There is a backlash now as we come to recognize that. And you will see, I think, changes of behavior from some companies. Apple is obviously embracing a strategy of defending privacy, and I think that's a really big deal. And to your question about selling data, if the only person affected by the sale of your data was you, that statement would be correct. The problem is the sale of your data can be used to harm lots of other people. And listen, we're going to have a debate about this. My point of view is I have no idea if it'll win or lose, okay? It's a legitimate conversation. We should be having it. But what I'd like you to consider is this isn't about you. It isn't about me. It's about the fact that this data is being used against whole populations.
All right, 4 minutes for 3 more questions and 3 more answers. And there's a guy there with a mic here.
Yeah, hi, Danny Ratti. I like to think of myself as a specialist in education technology, and I was just wondering whether you've come across any examples, evidence that big tech is messing up education system to gain the advantages you were describing.
Of what kind
Education system,
Okay.
messing with education systems. Oh, my word. I'm not taking any of the group down here because you were at the meeting with Roger earlier on, so you've already had privileged access. I'll take the woman back there in glasses. Yep.
Hi, I'm Liv. I guess my question is, you say that regulation is important, and I agree with you on that, but when they already can make such accurate data models of us, when you say they can make voodoo doll models of us, then is it not too late to regulate that data?
Great question.
And then finally in the front row here, arbitrarily chosen, sorry to annoy everybody else, there's a gentleman with the tartan shirt.
Hey, Roger. For 2020, which candidates are you most interested in?
Okay, so to the question about education, one of the things that's really difficult right now is that these companies block access to all users. And they have used that control of the users to essentially identify things that might threaten them to either acquire or to crush. It's been very hard to create alternative visions and alternative models because they can arbitrarily lower the cost. And so the reason we want to use antitrust law is to empower and enable alternative visions to come to market. To you on the, what was that?
Too late. It's too late.
So
Raj.
the answer is we have to ban the use of data voodoo dolls, okay? That it's not enough just to have them no longer gather. They also cannot use. The enforcement of that is going to be very, very, very difficult. What I want to do is to zero base the use of data so we can have a thoughtful conversation about what are the cases where using data more aggressively would be appropriate, okay? And I don't know the answer to any of those questions. I take the extreme position because we need to have a conversation where both extremes are represented. The problem with the global data protection regulation is that it assumed the status quo as the starting point, and it moved 1% off of that. It's a really well-intentioned bill, and if it included all data, not just the data you put into the systems, it would be valid. It would really work a lot better. But it's been too easy to game it because the enforcement mechanism is not severe. And then he asked...
Which of the candidates takes
so,
this most seriously?
So very simply put, in the United States, this issue, I hope, will be a front and center issue in politics of both parties. At the moment, there's one candidate who stands head and shoulders above others on this issue, and a couple of others who get it, okay? And I'd say the people who kind of get it or making part of this are Amy Klobuchar has been very thoughtful about antitrust. I think Cory Booker gets the issue. I think there are a couple, you know, Bernie Sanders has been very angry at Facebook, but in a way that's very Facebook specific and therefore not as helpful. A couple of the people are actually apologists for this, right? And that would be Senator Harris and Pete Buttigieg. And then the person who stands head and shoulders is Elizabeth Warren, who very early identified this issue. The summer of 2017, she said to me, and this is more or less a quote, she said in 2008, the advantage the banks had was they had perfect information and they controlled the information that their customers got. I think something like that's going on with internet platforms. What do you think? I thought that was the single most insightful thing ever said to me by a politician at any level. And I think that she absolutely gets this, and it turns out she gets a lot of other things as well, so, you know.
Roger, that was great. I'm just going to share with you, because I'm doing this presentation tomorrow night about fake news and expertise and all this. And the Pew Research from America, one of the interesting statistics I was just reading, is that people in America significantly overstate their ability to distinguish fake news from real news.
Yes.
So people think they're good at it, and they're not nearly so
And
good
it
at it.
turns out that it is sadly directly correlated with education level. The better educated you are, the more wrong you are on your ability to tell the difference.
Very good. Okay, well, look, it's been that put me in my place. So look, it's been a fantastic session. Roger's been here for hours doing various things for us, so we're incredibly grateful to you. If you really want to understand this stuff properly, then get this book outside, and I'm sure Roger will sign it
I'd be happy
for you.
And if you have more questions, I'll hang around for a bit and take whatever questions you've got. I really want to thank you for coming out. And again, just imagine it as a thought experiment, okay? And if you work at one of these companies, recognize that I have no animus towards your company. I'm really looking at this as a social problem, a societal problem, and that we all have a stake in this. Because the question is, where are we going to live? And what's the political system under which we're going to operate?
So before you applaud, Roger, I just want to tell you more about the RSA's work on tech and society. So do check out our website, where you'll find information about our current projects and how you can get involved, particularly if you're a fellow. We're looking at issues ranging from privacy and disinformation to AI and ethics, including a new report on data rights, which we published today. But all now that remains for me is to ask you to join me in thanking Roger for such a terrific session. Roger McNamee.